So Tyrese Haliburton tore his Achilles. And did you know for $99 you could buy my Achilles program that will prevent all Achilles tears forever? No, wouldn't that be terrible if I sold somebody else's trauma, took somebody's trauma to sell my own stuff? A lot of people are making claims and suggesting they know why it happens, but most of us on social media aren't in the Indiana Pacers medical staff, so we're not really in the nuts and bolts of it to make a real assessment. There's just way too many variables when somebody gets injured. There's their training, what impairments were they working on, there's their diet, their stress management, psychosocial stuff, their metabolic health. There's tons of variables, and that's on a macro and a micro level, like what's been happening this season with Haliburton versus how's his training been throughout his teenage years. Maybe he had a really bad right ankle sprain in high school and started to unload it and it got weak. There's too many variables to really say why it happened. So we do know that once you have an injury, that becomes the biggest risk factor for another injury. That's how we knew when Tyrese Haliburton injured his calf in Game 5 that he was at risk for his Achilles injury. One of my mentors, Chris Johnson, had a great quote on this. I forget what his exact quote was, but it was something like, "You're only as good as how far you've rehabbed your last injury." And I know this personally. I've had some shoulder issues. I used to lift like a bro in high school, and I would bench press 3 times a week and play a ton of tennis and basketball. I injured my shoulder, and this was before I knew what I was doing, and I would just kind of stop for a little bit and then go back to it. I would do okay, then it would get injured again, and it was just that cycle of injuring it every couple years. And then finally I was like, I'm just going to go through the whole rehab phase. I'm going to go through that acute phase where you're just, building capacity. Then I'm going to work on the strength, and then I'm going to work on the plyometrics. And I took it through the whole thing, and now my shoulder is good, and I'm able to throw baseball for an hour with my 7-year-old without pain. So instead of making claims about how we can prevent all these Achilles tears in the NBA and picking apart their training that we don't know much about, I think it's a good opportunity to use these events to educate people on the recent advancements in tendinopathy research. So tendons have come a long way in how we treat them. If you go back to probably the 70s, you're going to see a lot of rest and ice and stretching. But really what we know now is that tendons need load. They need force. They need strength. When a tendon gets injured, it can get weak, and you need to put force through it to get that, what they call mechanical transduction, to heal it. So it's all about loading. Good analogy is like a bungee cord. If you're gonna go bungee jumping, you want a strong cord. You'd rather put more rubber bands on it than to stretch a car off of it for a couple days. You don't want to hit the ground if you overstretch it out. Tendons are kind of the same way. First you gotta, in the phase of tendinopathy rehab, first you gotta just build the stiffness and the capacity of the tendon. Then you gotta go through the next phase, which is force generation and absorption. And then there's that last phase of that stretch shorten cycle to kind of jump. And there's some research and a lot of anecdotal evidence that stretching is not good for tendons. Sometimes people feel good in the short term stretching them, but like a bungee cord analogy, you don't want to go jump off a bridge with a bungee cord that's overstretched. The problem with stretching is, 1, it can weaken the tendon, and 2, it can be very compressive and aggravating on the tendon. So it might feel good in the short term, but in the long term, it generally aggravates tendons. So this is why, in the last decade or two, people have moved towards dynamic stretching before activities. Stretching that's not long holds. The long holds can be very compressive on it. It can decrease the muscle strength and just not make the activity efficient, or worse, lead to pain. And also in the research, you'll see a lot of different loading strategies. Some people will recommend isometrics. Other people are all about the eccentrics. And then there's a slow, heavy, resisted. I think what they found is that all those are great and they all work, especially for pain. So a lot of it is adapting the strategy to the patient or person. You do need individualization. I think the overall reaching theme is that you want to make sure that tendon and the strength of the legs, all the muscles are rehabbed appropriately. Another thing is that tendinopathy rehab takes a long time. It might take 6 to 8 weeks to really start feeling better, but to fully heal, you're looking at anywhere from 3 months to a year. So if somebody's selling you on magic that your tendon's going to be magically healed in 2 weeks, it's probably some snake oil salesman. It's probably more sales than medicine. Another thing about tendons is it's all about managing loads. So you've seen this in the NBA where they talk about load management, and that's what that is. They don't want NBA players playing all these, a ton of games at this fast pace, back-to-backs, travel. And it's the same thing with anybody. If you have an Achilles tendon, that's really irritated and you want to get back to running, once you get back to running, you don't want to go running every day. You kind of need to manage those loads. And then on the days you do run, maybe you take it easier with your strengthening, or maybe you don't run as many errands. You don't want to go to Costco and mow the lawn and then go on your run. It's better to manage those loads so you don't overload the tendon. The second thing that I think it's good to talk about is the post-op protocol with an Achilles repair. I think it's been known in the research for decades of the importance of avoiding elongation after an Achilles repair. You want to make sure that Achilles tendon still has its stiffness in a shortened state and its viscoelastic properties. You don't want to overstretch it after an Achilles repair. If you do this, a lot of times you can't undo it. And they're finding that sometimes is what leads to whether you have a good or poor outcome in an Achilles repair is that initial phase. So that's why I think it's really important, if you've had an Achilles repair, to protect it for a long time and take your time with it. I had this one Achilles patient. He got his Achilles repair and he came in and I was explaining that concept. I was like, hey, we gotta, we'll strengthen it, we'll get it strong, but we gotta make sure we don't overstretch it. And he was talking, and it turns out that like 5 days after his Achilles repair, he was getting married on the beach. And he's like, he's like, I didn't want to get married and wear that boot and walk on the beach for all my wedding photos. He's like, so I took it off and I just walked on the beach barefoot. This is like a week after his Achilles repair. So he probably overstretched it there, which will impair his ability to optimally get that tendon functioning. So be careful if you've had an Achilles repair and really, really focus on that initial protective phase. So in summary, there's 3 things. 1, injury prevention is very difficult, and the most important one is having a previous injury. This is why it's important to rehab all your injuries. Number 2, to treat tendons and rehab tendons, you want to build strength and load capacity. You need to work on these tendons' ability to absorb and generate forces. Stretching is generally not good for tendons. And number 3, if you've had an Achilles tendon repair, be very cautious and protect it in that initial phase. And I would almost extend that protection phase for that specific repair.